But first, we'd like to dedicate this event to the complete recovery of Yosef Akiva ben Yocheved and Shlomo ben Saradina, a cousin and friend of dear alumni. Thank you.
Okay, so the way we'll operate this meeting, as many of them do, we have a chat, and anyone, as Shua is speaking, would like to comment on something, please put it on the public chat. If he's able to address it directly, he will. Otherwise, we are going to have a Q&A session after his formal talk, and so those questions will probably be addressed at that point. And so, you know, we look forward to, you know, both sessions, and please feel free. This is we'd love to have a real kind of discussion in the question and answer. So we look forward to hearing what you know, the presentation and then afterwards. So I have the honor of officially introducing our speaker for today, our own Rabbi Shua Hoexter. Shua is here tonight to talk about social vision, the Lubavitcher Rebbe's transformative paradigm for the world. And he moved to Pittsburgh in 2003 with his family to work as a software engineer and joined the staff of Chabad House on campus, and with, you know, together primarily with his wife Shoshana. And since then, he's worked on train dispatch systems, a pharma research app, medical speech recognition, and currently does data center automation for Google. Shoshana now runs JGrads in Pittsburgh, and Shua is the director of Kiddush and Barbecued Chicken. The two albums he's recorded in his Jewish funk band Chillin' are on iTunes, YouTube, and Spotify, and he reads political philosophy books for fun. So without further ado, our own Shua.
Oh, thank you. Oh, I have a little guest. Oh, okay. If there's a mommy in the other room, there she is. Okay. All right.
Shua, if I can
okay.
one more thing, please. If everyone here can
yeah.
mute themselves, you know, please do that now, and unmute only when you need to verbally communicate, please. Okay?
Right.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you. Can everyone see the slide with the picture of the book? That's the thing you see? All right, cool. Okay, I got thumbs up. Good. Okay, okay, so thanks for joining. So tonight we're going to talk about Social Vision. It's a book by the sociologist Philip Wexler, together with Ellie Rubin. The book came out last summer, but it's really part of a larger project to explore, as the subtitle says, Lubavitcher Rebbe's transformative paradigm for the world. The Social Vision project is two things. First, it's a deep dive into the Rebbe's message from an academic point of view. And second, it's an effort to expand its reach and get more people involved. So there have been conferences in university settings, and in a few days, I'm moderating a panel of community leaders who work on implementing the Rebbe's lessons and message for making the world a better place. And my goal tonight is to give you an introduction to Wexler's analysis and talk about what it means practically. So there's kind of a lot of information at the beginning. So if you get lost or space out, you know, hang in there. It gets better. It's not too long. I timed this to be about 30 minutes, which I think is a good length for a Zoom, you know, extracurricular class at 8 p.m. So as Rabbi Weinstein said, if you have questions, type them in the chat. If they're to everybody, I'll see them on my laptop, hopefully. And if it's a short clarifying kind of question, I'll, you know, I might take it right away. Otherwise, we'll have time at the end for questions, and then I'll also open it up for discussion. Okay, so the jumping off point in the book is this question: is there a way to repair society? And the thesis of the book is that the answer to this question is yes. And the way to repair society is by applying what Wexler calls the Hasidic ethos, which is more or less what we're going to explain in this class. But I want to point out that this opening question in the book is a loaded question, right? It assumes that society is broken in some way, right? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So if you think that everything's just fine, right? Nothing's wrong in our world today, but then, you know, then you don't need this class. But the book came out, can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay. So this book came out over a year ago, about a year ago. That's before the global pandemic, before national civil unrest. So the first thing we're going to talk about for a little while is how is society broken. So we kind of have a little bit of the doom and gloom in the beginning, and then the sunrise as it gets better. Okay, I saw this a few weeks ago, and I thought it was great and I thought it was appropriate because it made me think of how our experience of the world is as much interpretation as it is observation, right? I mean, how many times this year have you asked yourself, what's even happening here? And so the question, what's broken in society, is not a purely empirical question. It depends on your context. And a lot of times we take that context for granted. Our opinions about what's good and bad depends on our experiences, our assumptions, our priorities, our values. So we're all kind of coming at this from different places. You know, my goal is that no matter which direction you approach us from, right, left, all around, the Rebus approach may surprise you and hopefully expand your field of view. And so social vision isn't just something that the Rebbe had, it's something we should all try to develop, and that's kind of our goal. Okay, I think the way to start, the book is quite dense. There's a lot of information. It's a great book. It's very well written. It's very hard to summarize in half an hour. But I think the way to start is by talking about communication. Because, first of all, so we can have a discussion, communication requires breaking down those barriers that keep us kind of locked in to our own perspective, into our own viewpoint, and keep us from seeing another perspective, and keep us from seeing the bigger picture, and that's really our goal. Okay, so this insight into communication, I paraphrase from Naftali Lowenthal. It's quoted in the book, and this is actually one of the main things that I want you to leave this class thinking about, that there are 3 levels of communication. This is based on previous sociological work, but we'll just kind of summarize here. So basically, there's authoritative, cooperative, and collaborative. So authoritative is a rigid structure of instruction. So like in a class setting, the teacher gives information and the students write it down, right? It's very much a one-way street. In terms of Judaism, this is Torah communicating mitzvot, commands, and we accept them and we follow them. That's authoritative communication. Second level is cooperative, where we have a shared set of accepted norms, and then we can have a kind of cooperative rational analysis. So in a classroom setting, this might be the teacher explains something logically, and then the students can analyze it. This is very often the level that Torah study happens at, for example, in the Talmud, right? Understanding the structure of the rules and their meaning. Okay, and the third level is collaborative, where we have to justify the norms by examining what our motivations and goals are. So in a classroom setting, for example, a teacher and the students first have to establish a foundation. What do we want to get out of this? Based on that, what are the rules? Are rules even necessary? In Torah study, this would be the level of introspective questions like, what's the point of mitzvot, of commandments? What's the point of creation? Does God even care what we do? How can finite beings affect an infinite God, right? So once we kind of think about those motivational questions and goals, then we can establish what kind of norms, right, we're going to have. And there's 2 points that I want to make here. First, if we're going to talk about society, it involves some political issues, right? That's what politics is. So we have to be open-minded and try to maintain that collaborative level of communication. And second, and more specifically, in terms of the course content, and this is why Philip Hoexter quotes this in the book, Chabad Hasidic thought in general often operates on that third level of communication, on that collaborative, introspective level of communication. So it's well suited to this project of transformation. If we want to reimagine society, we have to ask, what are the implicit motivations and goals of society? What's a context that we take for granted? Okay, so that's where we're going to kind of start. And the context that we live in is a society built on capitalism. Some people are really unhappy with that, and they prefer if we just tear the whole thing down and start over with socialism. We'll get to socialism soon, I promise. But we're going to focus on capitalism for a moment. And I like this quote a lot. It's not from the book. It's from an essay by Irving Kristol way back in 1978. And he says, one of the problems with our discussion of capitalism, as soon as I say the word capitalism, we confuse it simply with commerce, with business. And who doesn't like commerce or business, right? But there's a difference. The difference is that capitalism says that commercial activity should be the dynamic force which shapes and defines the civilization. No previous society ever said that. And I'll explain what this means. So this frames the issue, which is that modern capitalism is a totalizing worldview. It takes over and squeezes out everything else. And you have to kind of beat it back by talking about work-life balance. The time that you're not working is a day off, and the day on is when you are working, right? Why couldn't it be the other way around? The days on are the days that you spend with your family, and the day off is the day that you leave and go to the office, right, or your home office. So how do you address this? So one approach, which Crystal called neoconservatism, he's kind of the founder of that school of thought, is that modern capitalism is pretty good, but it has to be expanded by religious values. So traditional Jewish society, for example, is very business friendly. The Talmud's full of discussion about business, but besides regulating commerce with laws about advertising, fair pricing, those sort of things, there are also limits on the time and impact of economic activity. We have a day for Shabbat when you don't even think about business. You set aside time for prayer and Torah study. Those are limits on economic activity. Faith in God is a value in Judaism, which counteracts greed and anxiety about money. So even though, business is a positive part of society, but it's not the totality. Any traditional society kind of had this quality. And that's all fine. We can make a class about Jewish business ethics. But there's a problem or a limitation of this approach, which is that in a diverse society, we're not all going to agree, right, on whether or how to incorporate religion. And so the Rebus approach, at least in the way that Social Vision presents it, is deeper than that. And while the Rebus approach is certainly undeniably religious in its foundation, it's also deeply humanistic in the sense that it works within the framework of human experience. So we're going to go under the hood, so to speak, to look at what capitalism has taught us to expect about life. Okay, and where Hoexter tackles this by following the approach of one of the first sociologists, Max Weber. In 1905, Weber published a hugely influential work of sociology called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. If you've heard of the Protestant work ethic, right, if you've heard that phrase, it comes from this. And Weber said that modern capitalism has a form and a spirit. And the form is the systems of law, technology, administration. And so if we're talking about repairing society, so that's one place to start, right? If the form of the systems aren't working, then we can fix the structures. We can make legal changes, technological changes, administrative changes. Those are all important. I don't want to, kind of dismiss it, but Weber and Hoexter following him was really interested in the underlying ethos or the belief system, the assumptions of a society built on capitalism. And he traces it back to the Protestants who believed in building wealth by working and saving. That's the Protestant work ethic. And the Puritans who believed in predestination, which means that you're basically either saved or you're not, and you can't change your fate. It's a really interesting work. It's worth reading. But to oversimplify what's really a subtle and complex argument, it basically comes down to the spirit of capitalism is a systematic, individualized, rationalized focus on working, earning money, and saving money. And that's basically what it's about. There are three main points. And again, this is kind of a simplification of a complex idea, but this kind of gets the spirit of it across. Okay, so people are divided between successful and failed. How do you measure success? You measure success by personal wealth acquired by work. And what emerges from that is basically that the focus of life is on working and accumulating as much wealth as possible. Weber quotes Benjamin Franklin, who wrote, "Time is money." I don't think Franklin made it up. I think it was kind of a folk saying or a Protestant saying at the time. But if you've heard that phrase, he really meant that if you're not using your time to make money, you're wasting it. Now, most of us are not quite that obsessed with turning every single minute into financial gain, but this attitude affects us in subconscious ways. For example, we treat wealth as a personal asset instead of as a communal asset. We treat wealth as a sign that a person is valuable, which is very different than treating wealth as a sign that someone's fortunate. right? When we describe someone, he's successful or she's successful, what do we mean? It's one of the highest compliments you can give about someone. It's one of the nicest things you can say. And what it means is that they're highly compensated. So it's worth thinking about, right? Why is financial success what we use to describe someone as successful or not? In traditional societies, wealth was meant to be shared, and personal wealth and personal value were not the same thing. And Weber talks about this at length. In America, we introduce ourselves by telling people what we do for a living, right? Which really just means what our job is. It's interesting, I'll point out, by the way, Weber noticed, he mentioned this in a footnote, that the Hebrew word malacha also carries kind of the sense that work is meaningful, that there's a correlation between spiritual work and physical work. But from a Jewish point of view, what we do for work doesn't define who we are. So it has some of that kind of connotation, but it doesn't have that full sense that we have in our society. Okay, so Weber observed that under modern capitalism, what we do to make money defines us, because that's what the system has taught us to expect about ourselves. We compete with each other to maximize our own economic success, and it's very hard to opt out. And I want to point out, this is not about greed, right? Some people say capitalism is about greed. Greed is a universal problem. I mean, Weber said every system has greedy people. Greed is something that everyone, kind of struggles with to some degree or another. And also, you can share what you have. You can be nice, helpful, and generous. What's unique about modern capitalism is the way that this extreme individual focus on career and earning money and saving money is a rational choice. It's the only rational choice. And by the way, Weber was not terrifically optimistic about where this was going. If you see this quote, I just love his language here. This determines the lifestyle of all born into this grinding mechanism. It does so with overwhelming force, and perhaps it will continue until the last ton of fossil fuel has burnt to ashes, which is an interesting thing to have said in 1905. Any case, okay, so what does this do to the spirit of a person, to their emotional state? Weber talks about how it creates a sense of utter inner loneliness, pessimistic and disillusioned. And loneliness is one of the chief mental health complaints that we have today. And what kind of comes out from Weber's analysis is that the social ills that we're so familiar with are baked into the system. It's not to say all the time, it's not every person, but there's this kind of disillusion and pessimistic individualism somewhere kind of simmering below the surface. So the question now is there a better way? And that's what social vision is exploring. So Hoexter uses the Hasidic ethos, and he pulls it out of a lot of sources, going all the way back to the Baal Shem Tov, really, the beginning of the Hasidic movement. And he says we can construct an ethic that has a much different spirit. It doesn't mean that everyone has to be Hasidic, but just like the secular modern capitalist system kind of has an affinity with Protestant and Puritan theology, so we can construct something that draws on the ideas and the values of Hasidic thought, especially the way the Rebbe taught it. And the main element of Hasidic thought that Hoexter focuses on is something that he calls the Rebbe's principle of reciprocity. The quote here is, individuals can only achieve personal success and happiness through engaging in a reciprocal dynamic of giving and receiving. It's kind of like Newton's third law for social interactions. Right? If you remember your physics, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So if I push against an object, that object is also pushing against me. And what this principle is saying, that in relationships, if I give to someone, that person is simultaneously giving to me, not another time, not to pay me back, not to return the favor, not as a transaction or agreement, but by receiving my gift, they are giving me the gift of giving. So they might need money, they might need a favor, a kind word, help in something, but I need something. I need the experience of helping another person, or I cannot be happy and successful myself. So the greatest signal of my own personal success is not acquiring money, it's giving it away. There's a great story, a famous story that the Queen of England is probably apocryphal, but in any case, the Queen of England asked Lord Rothschild how much he was worth. Right, the famous financier, and he gave a very low figure. And she said, "You're holding back. I know you're worth much more than that." And he said, "What I have today in the bank could be gone tomorrow. What I gave to charity, that's mine forever. So that's what I'm worth. And that's the number that I gave you." And so this applies in our relationships with other people. It also applies in our relationship with God. Contrasted with Protestantism, especially the Puritan variety that Hoexter discusses, that Weber discusses, in which God gives, but we can't reciprocate. So if every interaction is a two-way, interaction, two-way street, in the Hasidic worldview, by receiving from God, we're giving to God. It's like an electric circuit. Unless it's complete, it won't do anything. So there's a verse in Tehillim that the soul of man is the candle of God. Or you could say God's the battery and we're the light bulb, right? It has to be complete. It has to go all the way around. And so what kind of emergence from that is that the fundamental unit of society is not the individual, as Weber described, not the community, like as a purely collectivist, ideology would say, but the pair. It's the relationship. It's a pair between individuals. It's a pair between us and the community, and it's a pair, the relationship between us and God. And this is the second big take-home point for tonight. That this kind of society is characterized by transcendence, by joy, by connection, and by fellowship. Okay, so we're kind of at the halfway point here, and we'll go into the second half. So in the Rebus words that Hoexter takes this idea from, the Rebus says that there is no recipient who is only a recipient. There's no giver who's only a giver. There's no wealthy person who's merely wealthy, no poor person who's merely poor. That's from a talk in 1971. The Rebbe quotes this Meldrick from Vayikra Rabbah, Medrash Rabbah, which says, more than the householder does for the pauper does for the householder. The Rebbe reads this Medrash as saying that actually, if you want to quantify it, the rich person is more needy than the poor person. The poor person in this interaction needs money, but the rich person needs human interaction, right? So who's actually rich and who's actually poor? And this implies something very important. Being needy, first of all, is not a deficiency. It's not something to be ashamed of. Everyone's needy. Just we're needy in different ways. And this also says that we can only become whole when we fulfill another person's needs. And it also implies that everyone's valuable, because in every relationship, in every interaction, there's always something that someone can give to another, and then the other gives to the one. There's a beautiful story that illustrates this. There's a story about two Hasidim who took turns giving each other charity every other day. One would give to the first, and then the first would give to the other. But really, they were actually just passing the same coin back and forth. And the same coin every single day, back and forth. And the story goes that the Rebbe was very moved by this. It was effective because every day they did an act of giving and receiving. And so to deny your neediness as an individual, to deny a facet of your humanity, that should be regarded as an asset, not as a flaw. Okay, so at this point, we're going to move on to some examples of how the Rebbe looked at practical issues in society from this point of view, where every individual is essential and you find value by looking for ways to give. So we'll start on the topic of wealth. And the first quote here on the left is from a letter that the Rebbe wrote to someone. He was responding to someone who said, wouldn't it be better if everyone was equal, if no one was rich and no one was poor? And the Rebbe said, no, it wouldn't be better, because then no one could give. There would be no giving and receiving. But at the end of that quote, if no one can give and no one can receive, then no one will be happy. But the Rebbe says this does not contradict your valid complaint regarding the injustice of the massive divide. So the massive inequality, which is a big topic of discussion today, is unjust. And the term social justice is perhaps a polarizing term, but the concept is deeply Jewish, right? Tzedakah doesn't mean charity, it means justice. And it's not personal justice. It's not saying that a particular rich person owes money to a particular poor person. It's saying that as a society, we have, each one of us, a social responsibility to correct injustice in society. So that's the first point here. And then the second letter, the Rebbe to another person, the Rebbe takes us another step and says that there's a cosmic dimension to this. We elevate ourselves and others in society and all of our resources in a kind of, you might say, a social mystical justice. I think that's the term that Hoexter uses in social vision. That everything exists for a purpose, so it's not enough to just not waste your money or spend it on negative things, but you have to use it. You have to use it proactively and purposely. So this is a religious orientation, but it's not just regulating appropriate use of wealth, right? It's not like it's not merely an authority that's imposed from above. It's an alignment with morality and purpose and meaning that's generated from below. And that's a really important point. There's a degree of subjugation, right? There's a degree of limiting oneself, limiting the choices that we make, or making ourselves do things that we don't necessarily want to do in the moment. But the subjugation is freely chosen, and it doesn't diminish, it expands. The means is self-limiting, but the result is self-actualizing. And so there's a kind of magic to be found by interacting with the world this way, using the physical world and transcending the material world at the same time. Okay, next topic is the individual versus the collective. So we've talked a lot about the relationship between individuals, but how do you relate from the individual to the community? And the Talmud has this rule. It's basically just a rule of majority rules, right? Where there's a disagreement, the majority gets what they want. But the Rebbe takes that beyond the legal context and says, ultimately, in the end, this will turn out good for the individual as an individual. That what's good for others is actually good for the individual. There's no conflict between self-interest and group responsibility. And so just like we said regarding wealth, the means is self-limiting, doing for someone else, but the end result is self-actualizing. And I promised towards the beginning I would mention socialists. So the second quote here is really interesting. It's a little bit from a letter to Kaddish Luz, who was a leader of socialist Zionism. And there was a correspondence back and forth. And in this letter, the Rebbe is indicating that the choice between socialism and capitalism, between collectivism and individualism, between sharing and competing, it's a false dichotomy. The Rebbe is basically saying there has to be a balance. There could be and there should be a foundation of sharing resources, of basic support for everyone in society. How you do that is, a policy discussion, which the Rebbe didn't really get into details. But beyond that, there also has to be room for individual differences and for competition. There has to be ways that some people can be really good at something and other people are good at other things. And so there's a level of competition, but the foundation of it is sharing and cooperation. And then it'll be healthy. And so going back to Weber and the Protestant ethic, it's the radical individualism and the totalizing competition that's destructive. But a balance is a healthy thing to have. Okay, if there's one issue that was the Rebbe's issue, it was education. Actually, Congress every year, I think, declares the Rebbe's birthday as a day of education. The Rebbe was deeply concerned that education should have a moral and religious component. The Rebbe supported a moment of silence as opposed to a non-denominational prayer. There's an interesting history to that. But ultimately, the Rebbe said that a moment of silence as a kind of spiritual, private moment at the beginning of a school day will be a very positive thing. That people, the children in school can think about, what their education is for, what their values are. And the Rebbe supported the idea of moment of silence because then children would be instructed to ask their parents what they should think about. And the Rebbe very much wanted parents to be involved in their child's education, especially in terms of values. This is something that's actually an active area of implementation in public schools in different areas. On another occasion, the Rebbe spoke very positively about the character of disadvantaged children and how much potential they have if only they get the education they need. So there's a practical element to this as well as the moral component. And the second quote here is also interesting. It's from around 1979. The Rebbe supported President Carter's plan to establish a cabinet-level Department of Education. And at the time, the major American religious groups opposed it because they thought that it would interfere with religious education. But the Rebbe dismissed that concern. He said, in America, freedom of religion will prevail. And what really matters was that funding for education gets the attention that it deserves. And basically just, if you want to have good teachers, you have to pay them well, you have to pay them good salaries. It has to be comparable with science salaries. But the Rebbe pointed out just very practically that, that there's a built-in return, not only in terms of, you know, education and morality, but in terms of the economy. You'll spend less on the prison system, spend less in crime prevention, vandalism, drug abuse, health, welfare, and defense. All these areas will be improved if you spend money on education. Okay, so that takes us to prison, which is very relevant to current events. And I think these quotes are really powerful because of the moral clarity that the Rebbe had. Some might say that a person in prison has nothing to contribute, or they've kind of taken themselves out of, you know, productive society. The Rebbe said no, that the notion of creation, that every person is created by God, means that every person has a purpose. So locking someone up is the most inhumane thing you can possibly do. The Rebbe says it's antithetical to the nature of humanity. I saw some responses, some rabbinic response from Israel discussing this, because it's a practical, you know, issue in Israel. What do the rabbis think about the prison system? First of all, the prison system in Israel is generally more humane than ours. I mean, pretty much every country, I think, locks up a way smaller portion of their population than America does, even Russia and China. But in this rabbinic response, the idea is that it denies the image of God that a person is created in, to take away their freedom. Practically speaking, this is also an active area. The Aleph Institute is active in our region in Pittsburgh, and their offices are all around the country. It's a Chabad organization that provides support not only for religious needs of Jewish prisoners, but also education, counseling, family support, alternative sentencing, and other resources for both Jewish and non-Jewish prisoners. Okay, let's end with a story before the final slide. This is a picture of Shirley Chisholm. She was from Crown Heights, Brooklyn, where the Rebbe lived, and she was the first African-American woman elected to Congress. This was in 1968. And at the time, the House leadership assigned her to the Agriculture Committee, really to sideline her because of her race and her gender. She was upset. She's from Brooklyn, right? What does she know about farms? She wanted to be active in urban issues. So the Rebbe, through his secretary, sent a message asking her to come to 770, to the Chabad headquarters, to the Rebbe's office for a meeting. And she came. And in that meeting, he told her that this appointment was a gift. She could use her position to help people, her constituents and everyone in America, get the food that they need. He said there's so much surplus food and there's so many hungry people. So this is not, you know, a bad thing. This is a good thing. And after this meeting, she happened to meet Senator Bob Dole, who was then a young Republican senator from Kansas. And he, being from Kansas, wanted to figure out a way to deal with farm surplus. And so together, they expanded the food stamp program, which was a tiny little program at the time. They defended it against all sorts of legal challenges. They created the WIC program, which provides staples for parents and children. And at her retirement party, this second quote is from her retirement party, she went all the way back to her first year in Congress and mentioned the Rebbe. She said, a rabbi who is an optimist taught me that what you may think is a challenge is a gift from God. If poor babies have milk and poor children have food, it's because this rabbi in Crown Heights had vision. So that's the social vision that we're talking about. Okay, and I'll wrap it up with this. We talked about the ethic of capitalism being hyper-focused on individual economic success and competition, and the Hasidic ethos being focused on reciprocal fulfillment between one person and another, between a person and the community, and between a person and God. And where social vision brings us to a close in the last chapter is really inspiring, because it talks about how the Rebbe's message integrates divine morality, religion, and human well-being, like I spoke about before, because he has an integrated vision. There's no dichotomy between secular and religious, between humanistic and theological. And we really see that in this quote from the Rebbe. The world should be such that wherever one turns, one sees divinity, because everything is being conducted with charity, justice, and in Judaism, Torah study and mitzvah performance. So the Rebbe's goal and the Rebbe's messianic vision, the dream of Mashiach, is not a theocratic authoritarian state. It's not about forcing people to perform religious rituals. That's not what it's about. In Hasidic thought, and especially in the Rebbe's thought, it's a holistic vision. It's a kind of theological humanism that has both a specifically Jewish dimension and also a broader moral component. And finally, there's a famous line from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, the former chief rabbi of England, who said that the Rebbe didn't create followers, the Rebbe created leaders. So it's up to each one of us to create that world that we want to live in. So thank you for listening, and we can have questions, discussion, schmooze, whatever you want.
Yeshua,
I can.
if people can either write into the chat, or I guess if it's not too, if it doesn't come too fast and furious, maybe someone can unmute themselves one at a time and ask a question if you'd like to.
Yeah.
I guess everybody's either heard this before or it's so resonated with everybody that they're just speechless. I guess.
I'll ask a question. I'll ask a question. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So I want to know,
Yeah.
is the human drive for to be competitive? You know, that's what drives us. We're competitive. Is that a result of capitalism, or is that intrinsic to human nature? Does it go contrary, this way that spirit is so strong in everybody? Does it go contrary to the Rebbe's vision? Can it, how can it help the Rebbe's vision?
Oh, okay. Yeah, good question. No, it's definitely not contrary to the Rebbe's vision. I mean, the Rebbe says in that letter to Chodesh Luz that you have to have a balance, right, between sharing, cooperating, and competing. So I think based on that, and also based on reading Weber, and I mean, just kind of what we kind of know, you know, kind of, what's the word? We just kind of know, like everyone has a competitive spirit. I mean, kids, you know, compete with each other. So no, the competitive nature is as much part of human nature as the need to give and receive. And I think what the Rebbe is bringing here, what Weber noticed was that it became just kind of this totalizing an extreme form, right? Where all you're doing is competing. Weber was much more focused on kind of the drive to acquire wealth through working and saving wealth and not even enjoying it. And competition was kind of part of that. But I think what the Rebbe is just saying is just that, you know, as much as competition is part of who we are, sharing and giving and receiving is very much part of who we are. And they kind of go together.
I have a slightly challenging question, but
Okay.
Well, I'd start by saying,
Yeah, I would not expect a non-challenging question from you. Okay, go ahead.
So first of all, I've only got the book at the end of last week, so I'm like 1 or 2 chapters in, and so I have a good sense of the whole picture beyond your talk. But I think the talk is really illustrative, so I thank you.
Thanks.
I guess the question is, I've lived in Brooklyn and I've had interactions with the ultra-Orthodox community there. And I think there's a very serious and sincere following of the Rebbe's teachings there. I don't have the sense that that community is known to their neighbors as beautifully generous, wonderfully social-minded, everybody, justice everywhere as a community. I do have the sense actually that internally to the community, that is the case. So is there a disconnect between the core of the Rebbe's teachings and either the conception of the community from outside, or is there an actual disconnect between the core of his teachings and their practices, or what's going on?
That's a great question. Yeah, that was actually one of the early reviews of the book, Social Justice, basically kind of made that point, but less kindly, let's say, than the way you put it. And there are even, I just heard a recent review who also kind of made the same objection to this book. It's a really good question. So I think what I would say is that the Rebbe's message and the Rebbe's view was very broad, right? And it was kind of different aspects of it fit different audiences. It doesn't mean that the Rebbe was saying two different things to different people, but the Rebbe was saying something that was very broad and kind of, related to different people in different ways. So coming from, in terms of like the Hasidic community in Brooklyn, right, which is socially organized as a relatively insular community. We could drop the relatively, right, as an insular community. And there are social dynamics in the neighborhood, right, which some members of the community are very interested in actively working on improving. Some are not that interested, so they'll take that place. I mean, they'll take that part kind of the Rebbe's message, and like you said, right, maybe apply it within their own community, which is also human nature, right? It takes kind of an extra effort to view our in-group as including people who don't look like us, who don't talk like us, who don't, act like us, who have different, community norms and all that. That takes an extra level of effort. So I think, I guess my thought when I read that review last year, who said, look, this is a really nice kind of, universal message, but the Rebbe was really limited. The Rebbe, followed fundamentalist Orthodox Jewish law and, and had all these restrictions. And so the way I think this happens is the Rebbe didn't just speak to Hasidim in Yiddish in the big shul in 770. The Rebbe sent shluchim, emissaries, who some of them are rabbis, and there are instances where the Rebbe said to professional people, "You're my shliach, you're my emissary, right? Bring my message into the university, into the workplace, right?" And obviously, just for myself, like when I bring, my Hasidic outlook into my workplace, right? It's not to, talk in Yiddish to everybody, right? I don't just mean the language. I mean, the concepts, right? There's a different aspect of that message, the broader message. I mentioned Aleph Institute, right? So, a Hasidic Jew in Brooklyn is not the typical Hasidic, even Chabadnik, right, in Brooklyn, is really not interested in visiting people in jail that are not his kinfolk, right? He's just not interested. But there are people who are. And so they take this aspect of the Rebbe's message, and for themselves, it means, being real stringent about Matzah and Pesach, but for everyone else, it kind of means something different. It just translates in a different way. I don't know if that answers your question or.
Well, Shua, maybe what you just said is what it says on the slide here, right? You said because everything is conducted with charity and justice, and in Judaism, Torah study and mitzvah performance. We're not expecting the whole world to be studying Torah and performing mitzvahs that they're for Jews. That charity and justice is a more global type of expression. So it depends on where you plug in, right? Is that sort of what you're saying?
Right. And that, yeah, that's what I'm saying. And also, to someone listening to the Rebbe's message here, different people are going to interpret it. Like I said at the very beginning, right? What you hear is not empirical. It depends on your context, right? So to a Hasid in Brooklyn, when he hears the Rebbe talking about tzedakah, and Gemil Sasadim, charity and justice, he thinks, oh, that means, giving my neighbor food for Shabbos, because he doesn't have, right? He doesn't think about his neighbor who's not Jewish. It's just not in his worldview. It's not in his context. But the Rebbe is not just speaking to that one guy. He's speaking to all of, his whole audience, which is much broader. And that's how I would kind of respond to question.
Shua, can you speak at all to the Rebbe's approach actually to, let's say, the surrounding community around Crown Heights? I know he had met with Mayor Dinkins at one point. There's a, well-known
Oh yeah, that's a really good point.
As well as like the whole moment of silence in public schools, which I don't think was directed just towards Jewish children, but of course to, the general public.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was just talking last night with someone who's been working on the moment of silence in public schools, and he said actually, in his view, the Rebbe was primarily focused not on Jewish kids. The Rebbe wanted Jewish kids to daven, actually, put on tefillin and say Shema in the morning before they went to school. The moment of silence was for the world. Yeah, you brought up a very good point. There were in 90, what year was it? 91, I think. There were riots in Crown Heights. There's a lot of unrest
92.
in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
92. There's a lot of tension between the Black community and the Jewish community in Crown Heights. Mayor Dinkins came to 770 on a Sunday and had a brief interaction with the Rebbe. And the Rebbe at that time handed out dollars to give to tzedakah. And the Rebbe said something about peace to the city, and Mayor Dinkins said to both sides. And the Rebbe responded that we aren't two sides. The Rebbe said that we're one side under one God in one city in one community. And so that captures at least what the Rebbe wanted people to think. I mean, that's also the other thing is, the Rebbe had a pretty ambitious message, right? Had high expectations. And so it's not just in the universal justice aspect of the Rebbe's message that his audience didn't always live up to, right? It's aspirational.
Hey, do you think that the Rebbe's vision, like sometimes you need to, combine a couple theories from a few different thinkers to get to something that really works? Do you think his would work on its own, or it's got to be combined with maybe some other people's ideas as well in order to work realistically?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean combined with other ideas. I mean, well, here we see, this whole, book, right? This whole project is, if I understand your question, right, is kind of that. It's kind of, it's really a translation project, right? When you translate from one language to another, you're not just translating words, you're translating ideas into a different context. So, so that's kind of how I see this, combining what the Rebbe said, and then what if we kind of, take that in the context of sociology, especially in the stream that Weber kind of started, right? So, and I think, whenever the Rebbe's ideas come into reality, it's through someone who has their own ideas. And I'm sure if somebody else presented this class, it would be with a totally different angle. And so there's always kind of that combination. The Rebbe was also very interested in getting other people's ideas, whether it was community leaders, whether it was politicians, whether it was scientists, whether it was, in whatever field. So the Rebbe integrated a lot of things, but also left a lot open for people to take their own approach. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, thank you. That's good insight.
okay. All right. We have some chat. Do we have some? Oh, it's a nice chat. message. Let's see. I think that the message for learning now, it's also the appropriate time to have that message be disseminated in new and more broad ways. The ability to have a voice in the broader world is a relatively recent phenomenon. Yeah, that's really true. Thank you, Nina.
I have a question.
Yes.
Uh-oh, Mendel, turn off your audio.
Okay.
When the world is so big,
The children have a question too.
where do we start?
That's a really good question. Oh, there's a saying from Rebus Salanter, who was not a Hasid. He started what was called the Musar movement. It was kind of an ethical movement in Judaism. And he said when I was young, I wanted to change the world. And I got a little bit older, and the world is very big, and I wanted to change my community. And I got older still, and I thought I would change my family. And now, you know, I think it would have been nice if I changed myself. And if I would have changed myself, then I would have had an effect on my family. That would have had an effect on my community. That would have had an effect on the world. So that's a good question, because these, you know, ideas in this book are very big. They're huge ideas, and it's very easy to either kind of, you know, think, well, you know, that's so gigantic that I can never do it, or it kind of loses meaning. So it's important to, again, translate. It's always, I think of a lot in terms of translation. What does this message mean on the big scale? And then what does it mean personally? You know, just in our everyday human interactions, how can we turn a competitive interaction into a cooperative one? Amina says, if we speak to others about these ideas, they'll grow exponentially. Yeah, it's absolutely true, right? Exponential growth. That's something we've become familiar with following the, you know, the COVID charts, right? What's the R naught of charity and justice, right? What's the base reproductive rate?
Thank you so much. I think this could go on and on, because your knowledge and your ability to explain is really very, very beneficial. So thank you for sharing that. And if anything, the way that the Rebbe really wanted every individual to be empowered and carry that message and do something with it, you certainly are a good example of doing that. So thank you.
Thank you.
May we each, I just want to remind people that we sent a brief email out asking if you could share 5 of your favorite quotes or ideas from the book, and in your own words, say why you think these ideas are important, and why this effort now is, you know, is timely in our society. If you don't mind sending that in, that would make the sponsor of the book very happy. And maybe we can keep exchanging more ideas to make an action plan for the future. So thank you so much, everybody, and thank you so much, Shua, for doing this for everybody.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone who's sending me messages on chat. Hi, Rebecca, and anyone else who I can't see. Some people off screen, but thank you all.
Good night.
Good night.
Okay, good night.